Card King, here I come. Hello, sports fans, sports collectors, and all hobbyists. Welcome to the Card King Sports and Variety Show. I'm your host, the Catman, Brian Cataquet, a.k.a. the Card King. We are live on ABC's KMET 1490 AM.com, your number one spot right here for news and talk on the West Coast. I thank everyone for tuning in this morning. On the telephone line, I welcome to the program a New York Mets pitching legend who has the distinction of being the first winning pitcher in Mets franchise history back in 1962. I welcome to the program Jay Hook. Jay, honor to have you. Thanks for being on.
Thanks, Brian. It's enjoyable to hear your voice and try to go back and remember 60 years ago.
Oh, man, we have Mets history on the airways in Southern California today. So Jay, prior to your years with the Mets, I understand you were signed by the Cincinnati Reds out of college. How did the Reds get a hold of you?
Well, I pitched at Northwestern University, but I was actually there on a basketball scholarship. I was just the pitcher on the team also. But in the summertime, I would always go up into Wisconsin. I lived in a little town about halfway between Chicago and Milwaukee. And in the summertime, I would go up to Wisconsin and play for different teams. And then I would also I was studying engineering, so I'd get an engineering job and then hook up with some kind of a, semi-pro amateur team. And that summer, I went to work for a liquor distributorship by the name of Schallert's Liquor. And Mr. Schallert, his son was a catcher on the Northwestern team. And he would, before I was going to pitch, he'd always call scouts. It's like an agent, but he wasn't an agent. Of course, he was just my friend. And he got several scouts to be following me. And the guy, can't say the guy's name anymore, but the scout that was following me, it'll probably come to me, asked if I would come out and throw batting practice to a guy they were thinking of signing. And so I went down to southern Wisconsin and threw batting practice to this guy. And he didn't hit the ball very well while I was pitching to him. Excuse me. And then that ended up, and about a week or two later, the Cincinnati Reds were coming to play the Braves at County Stadium in Milwaukee. He called me and he said, "Jay, would you come out and throw before the game?" And this is a big thrill for me. Here I was, a college kid, and going to, a professional locker room and field and all that. And so I went out and threw, and I think Bertie Tebbetts was the manager then, and I threw on the sidelines and wore a professional uniform and all that. And when I finished, I got dressed, and they came and they said, "Would you fly back to Cincinnati tonight on our plane and throw batting practice to the Reds tomorrow at Crosley Field?" And I said, "Gee, I don't know. I have a job." And I called this guy that I was working for in this engineering company, and he said, "Oh, Jay, that'd be fine." It was a Thursday night, I think, so Friday, I'd have to miss work. And so I did. I flew back that night on their plane, and the next day I went out and threw batting practice. But this was to Ted Kluszewski and Frank Robinson and Vada Pinson, Brian, the guys you saw that. And after I'd worked out, the general manager called me up to his office, and he said, "You're only 20, I guess, or 19 or 20. I guess I was 19 then. And he said, "We'd like to sign you." And he said, "But we can't sign you because you're too young." And he said, "Do you think your father would fly down here and co-sign with you?" I said, "I don't know. He owns a drugstore. He's the only pharmacist in that drugstore. I don't know if he can get away." And so I called him, and he said, "Well, yeah, I'll try to get down there." So they offered me a bonus. And, I wasn't thinking at that time. I mean, I'd have signed for an old glove, not any money. And but anyway, we agreed to a number, and then he said, well, also that's your first 3 years' salary. Well, the minimum salary in the major leagues at that time was $7,000 a year, and now it's $700,000, I think. But so it was several years of salary plus some bonus money, but with that bonus money, I had to go right in the major leagues. So I went home that night, and I had to join the Cincinnati Reds in September of that year. And with the way the bonus rule was set up, I had to go right with the club. And we went down to St. Louis, and I don't know where else. But and then the last game of the season, we were back in Milwaukee at County Stadium. And Bertie Tebbett said, "Kid, we're starting you again." And I think the Braves had won the pennant that year. They had a super team. And here I am now, I'd been pitching in Milwaukee on Sandlot stuff, and last game of the season against the Braves, I was starting against the Milwaukee Braves. And I threw 5 innings, and I came off the mound, and Bertie came up to me and he said, "Kid, you're too young to pitch a no-hitter. We're taking you out of the game." So that wasn't the real reason. He wanted to look at somebody else too, but that was his comment. So the next year that I went to spring training with the Reds, then they sent me to Nashville, Tennessee. Then I came back up with the Reds at the end of that season. Then the next year they sent me to Seattle, Washington. And Fred Hutchison was the manager out there for the Seattle Rainiers. I had a pretty good first half of the year, and the Reds called me up. They actually, what they did, they fired their manager, and they brought Fred Hutchison up to manage the Reds. And so, then Fred called me up because I was doing pretty well for the Rainiers. So that's how I got finally into the major leagues, was that second half of that season.
Yeah, and Jay, you mentioned the St. Louis Cardinals. I believe your first major league pitching debut came against the Cardinals back, I think it was September 3rd, 1957, where you pitched 2 1/3 inning. Do you remember that game?
No, only that I had to pitch to Stan Musial, and I was a little worried.
That's what I was going to ask you. I mean, like pitching to a guy like Stan Musial, I mean, how would you approach that? How would you battle him? You pitch him high and tight? Well, you had a good curveball also.
Yeah, I had a fast curve at that point, and I threw pretty hard. So when I was in high school, I think I struck out 188 guys in 90 innings, and so I could throw hard and had this curve, and you're always learning. They're always wanting you to do a little bit different things, but I just relied on those pitches with him, because I didn't know him. I didn't know what to throw to him. I didn't know what he hit, anything like that.
Yeah, and then your first major league win came in 1959 versus the Cubs, and you're facing a squad with Ernie Banks, another right. Vicious hitter. So yeah, I mean that was your first major league win. Do you remember anything about that game at all in '59?
Oh, yeah, I do, because I was in Seattle, and my wife was there in Seattle with me, and we had a little boy, and she flew back to Chicago because that's where her parents lived in Evanston, and I drove the car from Seattle to Chicago, and I think maybe I stopped for alongside the road for 4 hours of sleep, and I got to the park after I arrived in Chicago, and Fred said, "You're pitching the next day," which was great. And that was that game you're talking about that I pitched that day. And I loved, Wrigley Field was a terrific field. And they had something that very few people know about at that time. They were using that same field for the Chicago Bears football team. And so the mound was different in Wrigley Field than it was in other professional parks, because they had to, wipe off the mound after the baseball season, so the Bears had a flat field. So the mound was actually a mound at that point, whereas most fields, it's tapered from the mound off to the baselines. And when you stood on the mound in Wrigley Field, you felt like you were 8 feet tall. And, almost like you were throwing downhill. Plus, the stands were a little closer in that park. And so it was a great park to pitch in if you were a fastball pitcher,
We're talking with the first major league pitcher in New York Mets history to win the ball game for the franchise. Jay Hook is with us. 1960, Jay, regarded your best year in baseball, 11 wins that season. What were you doing differently that season? Were you feeling good? Your arm was rested? You definitely had strength winning 11 games that year.
Well, the Cincinnati Reds had a great team then. In 61, they won the pennant. And so, it was, I was a regular starter, but it, we had a great team behind us in defense, and we had a great team hitting. I'll tell you a funny story. Ted Kluszewski, one day we were signing baseballs, and we had 12 dozen baseballs to sign. We're all sitting there in a row with some tables, and on my left was Gus Bell, 7 letters in his name. Jay Hook, 7 letters in my name. Ted Kluszewski, I don't know how many letters. And all the balls were stacked up in front of Kluszewski. I'll never forget the image of sitting there with that. But it was Cincinnati just had a really good team in 1960. So, I don't think I won the most games for them. I think Bob Perkey maybe did. But they had a really good team. So I wish I could attribute that to my pitching, but maybe I helped, but it wasn't me all the time.
Yeah, and that 60 team, you had some veterans on that Red team, like Don Newcomb. I think Maloney was on the team as well, and Nuxall, right?
Right. Maloney was he had just signed, and he was a really young pitcher, and he was a great pitcher. I can tell you 2 stories about Maloney, and who was the other guy you mentioned?
Don Newcomb and Nuxall.
When Don Newcomb joined our team, I watched him because I like to learn things from different people. And I saw that he went out and ran every day before practice, and he wore a rubber suit to run in. I thought, man, maybe I better do that too. So I got a rubber suit, and I'd go out and run with him. And the only difference was he weighed about 250. I weighed about 190. And I started losing weight. and I got down to about 178 or 180, and I thought, I don't think this is working for me. I think he's doing it for a different reason. But Jim Maloney, so I got rid of the rubber suit after that. But Jim Maloney, when I was with the Mets, they came to town, and I pitched the game against Jim Maloney in the Polo Grounds. And he was a friend of mine. We traveled together. We ate in the same restaurants. We knew each other really well. He had come from California, and Pete Rose was the first batter. And I don't know if you guys know what the Polo Grounds look like, but the Polo Grounds were really short in right and left field and really deep in center field. It was because there was no polo field. And excuse me. And the first pitch of the game, let me get a drink here.
And I believe the Mets played at the Polo Grounds, right? While they were building Shea Stadium.
The first 2 years. But Pete Rose came to the plate as the leadoff hitter. He had an opposite field, I think it was an opposite field home run, that just like the first pitch of the game. And it just scraped the upper deck, and so it was a home run. I lost that game. On the first pitch of the game, I didn't give up another run. I lost it to Maloney, 1-0.
Oh, man. Unbelievable.
So it's memorable.
Yeah, I mean, it's unbelievable. So 57 to 61, you're with the Reds, and then 62 comes along, and you're with the Mets. How did that come about?
Well, since I'd had that bad year in '61, I was on the disabled list for a while, and then it really weakened me a lot. I had to stay at home, and they wouldn't put me in the hospital because I was contagious, and they didn't want me to be around the team because I was contagious, and I had a bad year, and I didn't know they were going to put me up on the draft. We had two kids at the time. For the World Series, my in-laws came to Cincinnati. The two kids drove back to the Chicago area, Evanston, because I was in grad school by that time, and my wife was finishing up some courses, and we were in our car, just Joanne and I, and we were driving through Indianapolis. We had the radio on, and I heard on the radio that I'd been traded or sold to the New York Mets. I wasn't aware I was even on the list up to that point. And so they sent me a text, the Mets did, and said, we want you to go to Mayo Clinic or somewhere and get checked out physically. Well, I did that, and I was in school, so I did that right in Evanston at one of the hospitals. But that was how I heard that I'd been sold. But the more I looked at it, to be honest, and as I analyzed who was drafted on that team, I thought, well, maybe this can't be so bad. Because, I mean, look at the players that were drafted on that. There were some guys, Richie Ashburn, Roger Craig, Gil Hodges I don't know if he was drafted or if he came to the team later, Duke Snyder, Charlie Neal, just a lot of guys that had been good players. I mean, they got a lot of Giants and Dodgers, because they knew the area. And so I thought, well, then maybe this won't be so bad.
And so Casey Stengel, right?
An optimistic view. And Casey Stengel was the manager. And so,
how did you get along with Casey?
You look at it and you say, well, how bad can it be?
Yeah, how did you get along with Casey? Did you get along well?
I could say very many positive things about Casey. And I'll tell you a couple funny stories. We got to spring training down in not Port St. Lucie like they are now, but it was over in Tampa or Bradenton or somewhere like that. And because I was at Northwestern, Eric Parsegian was the football coach at Northwestern at that time, and then he went to Notre Dame after that. But I would go out and play racquetball and do the exercises that the football team would do, and they were doing a lot of isometric stuff and with their football team, and I adopted that all winter. So I went to spring training really in good shape, and after every practice to start, when they have pitchers and catchers come in, I would go to the outfield and just do my exercises. And one day, Casey called me professor because I was in grad school. He said, "Professor, what are you doing out there in center field?" I said, "Well, I'm just doing these exercises that Eric Parsegian uses with the football team at Northwestern." And he said, "Well, I tell you," he said, "when the regular men come in, I want you to be our physical trainer, our physical conditioner guy." And so I said, "Well, okay." So I developed a number of stretches and kind of things that, to get. But back then, guys came in shape. Some came in shape, but a lot of them came to spring training to get in shape. That was they used spring training for. And a lot of the guys, when the regulars came in, weren't in very good shape. But here they were after 1 or 2 or 3 days. And Casey came up to me, excuse my language here, because this is what he said. He said, "Professor, you can stop doing all those stretches and exercises out there. Everybody's bitching and moaning so much about being stiff. Let them do their own thing to get in shape." But Casey was just terrific. I really liked Casey. His wife was a silent movie star, and they would spring training, and they never had any children. And we had these two kids, and whenever we'd go to restaurants, in spring training, and they saw us there, they would come over and say, "Hey, can the two kids come and sit with us?" And of course we said yes, because Joanne would dress the kids up pretty well to go out for supper. And so we had a great start with Casey, over those kids. But I really think the New York Mets and what the people that we drew in those first 2 years, probably, we almost drew as many people as the Yankees. And we're the worst team in baseball, or the worst record in baseball. I won't say the worst team, worst record in baseball. And Casey, after every game, would call, at that time in New York, there were probably, I don't know how many, 10, 11, 12 newspapers in New York. And the sports writers for each of those papers had to have 13 inches of column filled the next day. And Casey would call those guys into his office after every game. He'd get them a beer or he'd give them a Coke, and they would sit and he would tell them stories. And he'd talk about the game, but he'd also talk a lot about other stuff. And when they left his office, they had 13 inches of column filled. And that was the vehicle to get to the fans at that point. And, they, even though they televised games, a lot of people really read papers. And it just, I give Casey all the credit for the fan response that took place that year. We had terrific fans. They were out there. They had their banners. They were cheering. It was a great place to play, actually, at that time, even though we were terrible losers.
Yeah, and I have a couple of minutes left. I want to get this in, though. April 23rd, 1962, the Mets play the Pirates. You're pitching the game. Was there any pre-game preparation for that day? What were you doing that day, if you remember?
Nothing different. We talked about the hitters, and before the game, and then you go out and you play the game. And actually, we got ahead of the Pirates right away. And actually, I drove in 2 runs in the second inning with a hit, because Rogers Hornsby was another coach we had. And I did the same thing with him at spring training. I asked him if he'd go in the cages with me after practice, so if he could help me be a better hitter. And he did. He did. I think I tied for best hitting pitchers in the National League that year, maybe with Robin Roberts or something like that. I can't remember that. And but the game, the most memorable thing about that game was after the last pitch of the game, the last out of the game, I kept the ball from that game and put it in my pocket when I was going. And when I got in the clubhouse, Casey said, "Look," he said, "take as much time with the writers as you want." I think that was we had lost 9 games or something like that. We'd have been the worst losing at the start of the season, and the Pirates would have been the most wins at the start of the season if they'd won. And he said, "Take as much time as the writers want with you." So I took, answering questions and things, and by the time I got ready to take a shower, everybody had pretty much gotten dressed, and I went to take a shower, and there was no more cold water, no more hot water. It was just cold water. So I went and jumped in the whirlpool, because that was at least warm, and then got dressed and got in the bus. And we were flying to Cincinnati or somewhere. But it was, that I still get, Brian, I probably get 8 to 10 letters a month still. 60 years later, with baseball cards or something in them. And, that's ridiculous, I think, man, I must have signed all the cards that have ever been made. And why in the world would anyone want an old guy like me signing cards?
Well, you became the first winning pitcher in Mets franchise history, and you really came through. You tossed a complete game that, April 23rd, 1962, a 5-hitter against the Pittsburgh Pirates. And the Pirates, they had Clemente, Dick Grote, right, Mazeroski.
Right.
You remember pitching to Clemente?
Mm-hmm. Sure I do. he was one of the best players I ever played against, I think. He not only was a great hitter, but he could run, he could throw, was a great outfielder. He was a terrific player. His life was really cut short. I think he was doing ministry work or something in the Caribbean and was in a plane crash or something.
Yeah, so tragic. And then, I mean, 1964. That was your final year. What happened? You decided to retire from baseball?
Yeah. Well, I was traded. I was traded to the Braves, and they sent me to Denver. And I actually went to Denver, but I tore up my knee trying to take a shortstop out in a double play. From first base, and so I went to Milwaukee, got the rest of my 5 years in for retirement. You know, we didn't make any money then, so I retired and got a job in engineering.
And Jay, were you still following the Mets in '69 when they won the pennant?
Oh, sure, of course, yeah. They, and when Gil Hodges got in the Hall of Fame just recently, I thought he'd gotten in years ago. I was really surprised when they just got him in, because he was such a great player with the Dodgers, with the Mets. He managed the Mets, I think, in that '69 season.
Right. No, I mean, absolutely. And you played with him, so you knew each other well. Well, listen, I really appreciate your time, and it's an honor to speak with you, a longtime Met fan here, and thanks for being on.
Well, my pleasure, and hope the weather in your area of the country is as good as it is here. It's a beautiful day today, and I understand it's not so great out in Palm Springs.
I appreciate it, Jay. We just spoke with Jay Hook. Until next week, happy collecting to all.